Hi, everyone. Thank you for joining us. Today I have with me Dr. Laura Gellott, who is a great friend of the museum. And I've asked her here today because while I was cleaning out the files of my predecessor, I just happened to stumble upon an essay that Dr. Gellott had written about these three really amazing women that I had no idea about in Racine history. So you kind of stumbled upon them yourself in doing a project of your own. So why don't you tell me a little about that?
All right. Well, I was volunteering here at the museum for 3 years or so, I guess, after I retired from UW Parkside. And the project that Karen Brown, one of your predecessors, had me working on was going through scrapbooks that had been donated to the museum and writing up evaluations of them. And this was a scrapbook that, upon first glance, dealt largely with the life of Colonel William Utley. But it struck me as I went through this scrapbook evaluating it that there was another storyline in there, and that had to do with three very interesting women who were all in some way connected with Colonel Utley. Not in real direct lines, and that's why we're going to be showing from time to time during this interview a family tree, so that we see how Amy Davis Winship, Elizabeth Davis Worcester, and Marguerite Davis all have some connection to the Colonel Utley story. And so once I finished writing up this scrapbook evaluation, I then turned my attention to looking more deeply into the lives of these three women. And the essay that you found, in fact, was the manuscript for an article that was published in the museum's newsletter. And if we can draw any lessons from this whole exercise, it is that important discoveries in anything, but also in history, don't always come down the main line. I thought I was looking at something about Colonel Utley. It turned out that in there was another story of these three fascinating women.
So then why don't we dive into the first of those amazing women, Amy, who I believe is kind of the beginning of this story.
Amy Davis Winship, indeed. Amy Davis Winship, just refer to a few notes here, was born in 1831. She was the daughter of English immigrants, parents who had come directly from England. And in a story that is not uncommon, that family successively moved from New York, where they first landed, to Ohio, to Indiana, and then to Illinois. And it was in Illinois that Amy spent much of her childhood. She finished school at age 16 in 1847. And very typical of the situation then, if you finished school at 16, that qualified you to teach children from first grade up through age 15. So within a few months of finishing school at age 16, she was teaching in the very same school that she had just attended a few months earlier. 2 years later, in 1849, when she was 18 years old, she married John Davis. He's still living now in Stevenson County, Illinois. The couple had 4 children, 3 boys, 1 daughter, the daughter Elizabeth, about whom we'll hear more later. 2 of the boys died very young, one as an infant, one when he was 2 years old. And Amy later said that it was the loss of these 2 children at such a small age that got her interested in the abolition movement, because she could imagine as a mother what it would be like to have your children taken from you, as of course was the situation in slavery. So this was the beginning of Amy paying attention to issues beyond her family, beyond her farm, and would really launch a lifetime of social involvement. Amy's husband, John Davis, ran for the state assembly in Illinois, and he served alongside Abraham Lincoln. And so the day, it's very appropriate that we're sitting here in front of some Civil War photos and memorabilia, because the Civil War is going to play an important part in the stories, especially of this first generation. So friends with Abraham Lincoln, Lincoln and John Davis serving side by side. I also want to mention, and here's another element of the reform milieu of the 19th century, a neighbor of the Davis family was a man named John Adams. Adams with 2 D's.
Okay.
And his daughter, Jane Adams, would go on to become the important Chicago social reformer.
Mhm.
And so this is another friendship that Amy would cultivate during her life with this daughter of John Adams, their neighbor. But back to Abraham Lincoln. All right, so the 2 men serving side by side in the Illinois Assembly. And then at the time that Abraham Lincoln was running for Senate in Illinois against Stephen A. Douglas, Amy attended 5 of the 7 Lincoln-Douglas debates, the senatorial debates. And I just want to read something from an article that was published in the Racine Journal-Times on September 29th, 1998, because periodically the story of these women, or at least one of them, would surface in Racine, and the Journal-Times would write an article. Okay, so this article says, in part, Winship, or Amy Davis, as she was still known then, and Lincoln became friends while her husband served in the Illinois state legislature. She met Lincoln at the Jonesboro debates, where he verbally battled his senatorial opponent, Stephen A. Douglas. She saw the future president standing at the window before the debates and approached him. They had never before met. So although Lincoln and her husband worked together, this was her first personal encounter with Lincoln. Quoting from Amy, I went up to speak to him, and as we gazed out upon the people coming into the debate, a mule team drove up carrying a group of Douglas adherents with a campaign banner mounted upside down on its standard, she recalled in her autobiography. I said, do you see that? Here where Douglas holds sway is ignorance. Up north where you are the champion, we would find no such display of ignorance. We would see intelligence. This prompted Lincoln to chuckle. And of course, what she's referring to here is these people who had hung the sign upside down may well have been illiterate. And so she's making an inference, justly or not, about Douglas supporters based on that. Lincoln, of course, did not win that senatorial campaign, but he went on to become president 2 years later, again defeating the same Stephen A. Douglas. All right, so this, of course, Lincoln being elected president. Now we come to the time of the Civil War. Amy's husband, John, went to fight with the Union Army, and he was killed in 1862. He died of his wounds. She was able to travel south to be with him, and he died a day or so after she got to the hospital. So she's now left a widow. Her 2 surviving children, John Jr., about 8 years old, and Elizabeth, age 3. So she's a young widow with very young children. She had friends in Racine, Wisconsin, and in fact had visited Racine earlier. And this was her first encounter with the Unitarian Church, which is a theme we might come back and talk about a little later.
Right. A lot of these women that we're going to talk about
yes,
were all members of that
all
church.
members of the Unitarian Church, as indeed Colonel William Utley was as well. So that's a constant thread in all of these stories. So having friends in Racine and having enjoyed the time that she had occasionally spent here, she decided to move here, which she did. And in 1870, several years a widow now, she married a man named Eugene Winship. And the 2 of them then, and he was also, he was a widower, so second marriage for them both. They purchased a house at 73 8th Street, really just a street over from, if we could take down the wall, we might be able to see.
Right on the south side of the old YMCA building that's down here in downtown.
Right, and behind the Marsh Meredith Funeral Home. Okay, and you won't see the house anymore, we'll talk about that later. Okay. So they purchased that house, lived there. And with her oldest son, or the surviving son, John Davis Jr., now grown, and Elizabeth, a few years older, this allowed Amy to really begin pursuing some of the social causes that had first interested her when she embraced the abolition movement. And the first thing that interested Amy was the temperance movement, trying to abolish alcohol, the drinking of alcohol. Something that would achieve at least temporary success, or not so success, with Prohibition in the 1920s. But It was with this temperance movement that she became friends with Frances Willard, the woman who was nationally known as the leader of the movement. And Frances Willard was just the first of many important guests who came to stay at 73 8th Street. Let me just say briefly, what's the connection of temperance to women and reform? The feeling was, with a great deal of justification, that men drinking heavily put women and children at risk from what today we would call domestic violence, or even from men, because workers were often paid in direct cash pay packets on a Friday or a couple times a week, and not unheard of that they would stop at the saloon on their way home. And one thing leading to another, and by the time the husband came home, perhaps the rent money and the grocery money for the week was gone. And so women who were involved in temperance really saw this as something that helped women and children. So we mentioned her friendship with Frances Willard, and Willard coming through Racine on speaking tours, national speaking tours. On the local level, Amy's activity took the form of opening clubs, coffee clubs, especially for single working men, the ones felt to be at some particular risk of spending their money in taverns and so on. But these clubs were also open to married men. They served only coffee and water. They didn't play card games because it's a short step from that to gambling, but board games. They had a reading library of magazines and books. And when finances ran low and this group of women, led by Amy Davis Winship, couldn't afford to rent a storefront in downtown Racine, she would open up this club at her home and invite men to come in. So that was an interest, the temperance movement. And it was from temperance that she then came to embrace the women's suffrage movement. Initially, she, like many women reformers, were not in favor of women's suffrage, but Amy, like a lot of women, came to see that if women didn't have the vote, then they couldn't get through these other reforms. This initial belief that, well, we can argue from a position of moral superiority and politically disinterested, just putting forth good ideas, that wasn't working. They needed the vote. So she came to embrace that cause, and that brought her into contact with Susan B. Anthony, who, again, an inveterate traveler across the country on behalf of the suffrage movement, came regularly to Wisconsin, came frequently to Racine, and stayed at 73 8th Street. Amy's husband, Eugene Winship, whom she had married in 1870, by 1900, his health was beginning to fail. And so the couple left Racine, traveling first west and then south in search of a better climate. We can understand and appreciate that. Eugene Winship died in 1906 in Texas. And in her published memoir, and I think we'll be able to show a photo at least of that book, published in a series of long forgotten but deserve to find a new audience books. In that memoir, Amy writes this beautiful summary of where she's at in her life at that point. She says, 50 years of my life have been blessed with the comradeship of two good men. With the one, I spent the years of my youth and won the sacred benediction of motherhood. With the other, the years of mature life, from which there flowed a beneficent self-expression. The cycle of married life closed. I now became a citizen of the world. And so for the next a little bit less than 20 years of her life, Amy started attending college. And in fact, she was written up nationally as the oldest co-ed, and some would even say the oldest college student in the United States.
Right. It's never too late to learn.
It is never too late. She was today what we would call a non-traditional student, or maybe a senior auditor, because she wasn't pursuing a degree. She was taking courses that interested her. And she writes in this memoir that she had always been interested in history, in literature, and philosophy. And now at age 70, 73, 75, she had the opportunity to do that. She enrolled for the first time at Ohio State University. And eventually, as she traveled around the country, staying with friends, including at one point Olympia Brown. She was living with Olympia Brown when she attended Johns Hopkins, the University of Texas, the University of Wisconsin. What are some of the other institutions that she attended? She came to know of Fisk University when she was in Tennessee. And in her will, she would leave a generous bequest to this historically black college. Mm-hmm. And so we see here coming full circle of the first issue that brought her into the wider world, concerned with the abolition movement, leaving money to fund this African American institution. Amy died in 1923, and she was 92 when she died. So a good long life. So a little over 20 years.
A very full life.
A very full life. Yeah.
Okay, and then our second person is Elizabeth.
Yes, Elizabeth Davis Worcester.
And what's her relationship to Amy?
She, and we'll put up here again the family tree so you can see the second red or pink box. And as you follow the lines down, you'll be able to see that Elizabeth is the daughter of Amy. So she's one of the two surviving children. Mm-hmm. Elizabeth came early to the suffrage movement because she was still a young girl when Susan B. Anthony was a guest at the house, 73 8th Street. And in some ways, it's maybe surprising that Elizabeth became such a committed suffragist because her meeting with Susan B. Anthony was not a happy one. The story is told many times by Elizabeth and by Amy in her memoir that Elizabeth came into the house with her apron full of newborn kittens. And it turned out that Susan B. Anthony had a phobia about cats. As a cat lover, this leads me to think a little bit less of Susan B. Anthony. But Susan's response was, "Oh, horrid, get them out. You know? And Amy wrote that Elizabeth never quite forgave Susan B. Anthony for that. Nevertheless, Elizabeth, like her mother, became a committed suffragist, a committed civic activist, and what we call a club woman. She joined organizations that embraced various reform causes. She was a charter member of the Women's Club of Racine, which was founded in 1896. And the Women's Club here, like its counterpart across the country, spearheaded such movements as the campaign to open a public library, the campaign for clean and well-lit streets, again making this safer for women and for children. They advocated for the opening of kindergartens, which was still a new movement in the 19th century, one brought to this country by German immigrants, but not yet widely embraced. And they campaigned for the inclusion of music and arts programs in the schools. We could use more of that again now.
Right.
Yes, some things never go away. The Women's Club in Racine split in two over the issue of women's suffrage. Half of the club supporting it and the other half not. And I alluded to it a little bit a few minutes ago when I said that a lot of women, including such prominent women as Eleanor Roosevelt, initially were opposed to women getting the vote. And this came from the belief that if women got into the dirty, male, wheeling, dealing world of politics, this would diminish the moral force of the kind of reform agenda that they were pushing.
Right. You can't help but be in politics and be a little bit almost corrupt.
That was what they felt.
Yeah.
And they also felt there was this notion there in the late 19th, early 20th century that women occupied a separate sphere from men, this whole phrase, separate sphere, and that this separation of spheres made them morally superior, perhaps legally inferior, but morally superior. And from that position of moral superiority, they could push a reform agenda, and they would fall off that pedestal if they had the vote. Okay, that was the feeling. Well, many women began to change their minds, and the Women's Club in Racine, like so many, split in two: a pro-suffrage group and an anti-suffrage group. Elizabeth kept her membership in both organizations, foreseeing that the day would come, and she was correct, when the pro-suffrage group would, as she said, put itself out of business. And so when women's suffrage became the law of the land in 1920, the issue that divided the Women's Club of Racine was gone, so they came back together, and there was Elizabeth. She had never left. So her activity then as a clubwoman. Elizabeth Davis Worcester, we should say something about her husband, because, and if we can go back to the family tree here, it is with Elizabeth's husband that we hook onto the Colonel William Utley story. And you'll see as you look at this family tree that Colonel Utley had also married twice. His wife died while he was away fighting in the Civil War. His first wife, Louisa, died in 1864. You can see there on the screen. And a few years later, Colonel Utley married a Sarah Jane Worcester. And Sarah Jane Worcester, that was her first married name, Worcester, and she had a son from that marriage named Park Worcester. So Park Worcester is now the stepson of our Colonel William, and it is this Park Worcester who marries Elizabeth Davis. The two of them moved into 73 8th Street.
Right over there.
right over there. Left to them by Elizabeth's mother, Amy. Okay, so now they are the couple living in the house. The house really is the fourth character in our story. If we are talking about Amy Davis Winship and Elizabeth Davis Worcester, and soon to be Marguerite Davis, what ties all of them together, besides the Unitarian Church and so on, is residence in that house. Okay, so Park Worcester. Something else that I really want to emphasize about Elizabeth's life is this theme of education. We saw how important education was to her mother, who, although deprived of higher education as a young person, pursued it at age 70. Elizabeth had the advantage that her mother did not. She went on to college. She studied at what only shows up in the sources as the School of Oratory in Boston, and I've not been able to pin that down any more specifically. But upon returning from there, Elizabeth came back to Wisconsin, and she taught for 4 years at Downer College in Milwaukee, and she taught elocution and public speaking. So I think that gives us some clue that she was probably a very effective pro-suffrage campaigner. She could speak well. She too, like her mother, was a member of the Unitarian Church, a friend of Olympia Brown, and of Olympia Brown's daughter, Gwendolyn Willis. And so that continuity there. Elizabeth died in 1937, and her husband died a year later in 1938, at which point the house passed to Elizabeth's niece, and we'll look again here at the family tree, Elizabeth's niece, Marguerite Davis. Marguerite Davis is the granddaughter of Amy Davis Winship, and the daughter of that John Davis Jr., the son from the first marriage. We should, as the family tree notes, call him Dr. John Davis. He was a medical doctor, and he taught on the faculty at the University of Wisconsin in Madison, all the University of Wisconsin that there was at the time. And his daughter Marguerite followed in his footsteps as a scientist. She began her education at Madison, took some courses then at the University of Chicago, and completed her Bachelor of Science degree at the University of California. She then returned to Madison and pursued graduate work, although she never finished a master's degree. She went out to New Jersey and worked for a while with Squibb Pharmaceutical, one of the leading pharmaceutical companies then, and I believe in at least some merged form. They are still around today. Returning to Wisconsin, to Madison in particular, she could never quite leave that behind. She got a job as an assistant to an Elmer McCullum, and the two of them together, working in their laboratory on the field of vitamins and nutrition, succeeded in isolating, discovering, and naming vitamin A and vitamin B. And as is so often it's the case that the woman working alongside a more famous man does not get the credit.
Right.
To Elmer McCullum's credit, he shared the claim to fame with Marguerite.
Right, her name was on this research,
Yes.
which I did notice, and I was honestly very, very shocked by, but I was like, that is cool. She got her credit for this.
She got her credit, she did indeed. And in the wake of that discovery, she went on to set up the nutrition lab in Madison, and then going again to New Jersey, must have been something that called her back there, she set up a similar lab at Rutgers University in New Jersey. Upon her retirement in 1940, she returned to Racine and took up residence in the house. We noted that her mother had died in 1937, her stepfather in 1938. The house was being lived in by Marguerite's only brother, John Archibald Davis. He's on the family tree. So the two of them, two people who both single, never married, moved in together into that house. So there they are. Like her aunt and her grandmother before her, she was also active in civic affairs. Everything from the Historical Society to the Racine Garden Club. Also a member of the Unitarian Church, friend of Gwendolyn Willis, daughter of Olympia Brown. And Marguerite Davis died in September of 1967, 3 days after her 80th birthday. And upon her death, and we actually have a copy of her will here in the archives at the Racine Heritage Museum. She writes, "I consider that my home at 73 8th Street in the city of Racine, Wisconsin, and its contents are of historic value to the public in the Racine community, and I therefore desire that my said home and the physical contents thereof be maintained as a historic museum for the use, benefit, and enjoyment of the public. To carry out my desire, I give the real estate, 73 8th Street, etc., to the State Historical Society of Wisconsin, provided such society keeps and maintains it as a museum open to the public. If the society declines the gift, then I give this home and the rest of my estate to Racine County, Wisconsin, for its historical museum." Sadly, both the state and the county turned down the gift after her death.
Right.
The house stood vacant for a couple of years, her brother Archie having died, and the house was torn down and they put up a parking lot.
Right. Which is just so tragic, because I mean, when you think about it, really, anywhere where there's a very rich and very long history, like Racine, you could be on a place that just looks like a parking lot to you, but in reality there is a whole history that happened on that very spot that you're standing, and you have no idea what it is.
That's right. Susan B. Anthony slept here.
Right.
Frances Willard slept here.
Right.
Olympia Brown lived here.
And I think that's what's so important about historical societies and historical museums like us, is that we are charged with keeping those stories alive.
Right.
And I'm honored to be a part of a museum like that.
Exactly.
And that's part why I love my job, is because I get to tell stories like this that are just so amazing.
Right. I guess as we wrap up, one of the other things that strikes me, we talked at the beginning about discoveries not always coming down the main highway. I'm looking at the Colonel Utley scrapbook, and out of these connections come the story of these three women. The other thing that I said in the 2015 article is that we know the names of Susan B. Anthony, Elizabeth Cady Stanton, those people, but what we don't always appreciate is that across the country, in towns like Racine, Kenosha, Milwaukee, Appleton, Chicago, there were dozens and hundreds of women working on the ground, holding meetings, marching in parades for the cause of women's suffrage.
Right.
And for these other social movements. And these often unsung stories really deserve to be brought out of the shadows.
Wholeheartedly
and
agree.
Told as well.
Yeah.
And I, on that note, can't resist
Go ahead.
saying that I've recently published a book of my own, Helen Perry Curtis and the European Trip of a Lifetime, a biography of a woman named Helen Perry Curtis that focuses around her travels through Europe in the 1920s and 1930s with her daughters. But in the years leading up to that and throughout her life, Helen was also pro-suffrage. She took part in suffrage rallies before 1920. She and her mother took their first trip to Europe together in the summer of 1914, when the militant suffrage movement was very much a phenomenon in England. And they almost got to attend a rally conducted by Mrs. Emmeline Pankhurst, one of the most famous names in women's suffrage, certainly in European history, and influenced what went on here. Helen was also, towards the end of her life, a member of the Unitarian Church. So we see again that thread running through the lives of so many women who embraced social activism.
Great. And that book is available in our gift shop. If you would like to purchase it, either in the museum or online, I recommend that you do. We've heard nothing but glowing reviews about it. So feel free to do that. I want to thank you for joining me today. You are always just such a great resource for us, and you always know so much. It just blows me away. Thank you again for being here and taking us through this.
Very welcome. Anytime.
And thank you all for watching. If you enjoyed this video, please give us a little subscribe on our YouTube page and check us out on Facebook and Instagram. We are always posting very interesting historical content. So please check that out and have a great day. Thanks. Bye.